All right, so a lot of times we see some fairly straightforward um, questions on the exam that you can immediately go through and answer with no problem. Um, but then also sometimes we see some that are a little bit tricky. And so what I'm going to get into right now is talking about this thing called identification and authentication. And specifically, you will 100% see a question about identification and authentication. Usually, the context that we see is um, what is something that is used to identify you. And, there can be a number of different things, but um, usually what we see is identification means finding out who someone is, and authentication is the mechanism of verifying that identification that we just asked for. So if we look at it maybe a little bit differently, identification is claiming an identity, authentication is proving it. Usually, one of the analogies that you'll hear um, that any person can claim to be an identity, but to prove it, to authenticate it, that person needs to provide some sort of evidence. And that's why oftentimes when we get pulled over or we're going through, the airport or whatever, the first thing they say is license or registration, please, sir, or show me your passport, or something like that. So authentication systems are based on a one or more of some sort of factor of authentication. There's something you know, something you have, and something you are. So let's talk about these for a second. So you see them on the screen right here. Something you know could be a password or a pen or something cognitive, maybe your mother's maiden name or your first dog's name or, gosh, I don't know, your favorite teacher's name. Uh, you know what I'm talking about in those regards. I'm sure that if you've done the online banking or been alive recently, that you know what I'm talking about. Something you have is like a smart card. In the DoD, we use smart cards. A token, like a secure ID, like an RSA secure ID that changes with synchronicity every minute or so, or some sort of identification device. And then something you are is kind of obvious. It could be your retina pattern or fingerprint. Oftentimes refers to biometrics. Now, right now, fortunately enough, we don't have a lot of things that our biometrics are stored on, so that's a good sign. But we're starting to see implementation onto phones. We're starting to authenticate via biometrics to secure locations, like the SCIFs or closed loop networks, and those are the types of things that we see. Now, there's been recently two new connotations to this that have been added. Something you do, like an action that must take to complete the authentication, or somewhere you are, like based off of a geolocation. And usually the latter of the two, somewhere you are, is specifically starting to get to a proximity device. Now, that can be on your phone when you come close to your network. Maybe you set up your phone to automatically turn on all your lights or something along those lines. And what it does is use your IMEI or IMD to go and authenticate to your home network, and then maybe hooks into a Nest that controls the new Nest plugs that go in and control all your air conditioning and all your electronics and stuff. And you can hook that up to your phone and then authenticate somewhere you are. And something you do, We're starting to see some keystroke dynamics, keyboard dynamics, as well as physical patterns of behavior be introduced into authentication as well. And we usually would think about it in the context of, if somebody types a password, your hard password that you have, usually if you were to type it 10 times, an algorithm can be written to get a mean for each one of those, and then a standard deviation, either way, plus or minus, would give us the connotation of whether or not this person is authentic based off of n number of attempts in the past that have been successful. And if it deviates one way or another, it would lock that particular count out for that. Oftentimes the story that I'll tell in the classes that I teach is that I have a friend who, he's the guy that you always want to go to if you need something. And this buddy of mine, I recently went and visited him, and I walked in his house, and he had this Kobe Bryant jersey up on his window, or up on his wall. And I immediately, you couldn't miss it because I'm a basketball fan, and not necessarily a Kobe Bryant fan, but he's a great player. So I was like, whoa, that's a cool jersey. And my buddy's like, yeah, I traded a Callaway driver for it, and a brand new Callaway Big Bertha driver for it. And I was looking at it, and he's like, yeah, it's a signed All-Star Kobe Bryant MVP jersey. And I looked at it, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, cool. But now that we've been educated, we start watching the show Pawn Stars on TV, and we know that, hey, wait a second, does this thing have a certificate of authenticity? And that particular situation is very similar to what networks do whenever they're trying to go through and make sure that something is legit. Where is that certificate of authenticity? And in that particular case, in my buddy's house, he did not have one. And this something you do that we talk about, like an action that you must take to actually authenticate, it was not a certified authentication of a signed Kobe Bryant. So was it worthless? Probably not, because it was worth at least a Callaway driver to him. But I think you get the point there that it wasn't a one-to-one verification, and really that's what we're looking for whenever we talk about identification. Uh, Now, we can have single factor authentication, and you will see this on the exam. That's why I'm spending a little bit of time on this. Single factor authentication uses, you guessed it, one type of authentication. Usually the least expensive, out of the box, most often implemented is the traditional username and password combination. So the username and password are unique identifiers for a login process. And when the user sits down in front of the computer, first thing that person sees is the login and password, and the security system requires that you establish who they are logging into it. Identification usually can typically be confirmed through that login process, and most operating systems will use a user ID and password to accomplish this. Uh, in that particular case, we're starting to see a lot of the big dogs out on the web come to more taking over the world, like Facebook and Google. They're starting to use you can use Google authentication on websites, or Facebook authentication on websites, because some of the newer websites don't want to put the money into what it takes to build that infrastructure for that single sign-on. In that particular case, they would use and transfer the risk over to Google or Facebook to authenticate them, which, it seems to be working pretty well for those guys. So single factor uses one, multi-factor could use any of the two, and it is considered strong authentication to use two-factor authentication. Two-factor authentication. So that could be a user ID and password and a smart card. One of the questions that I usually hear people say that they see is, they get a question on identification and authentication and it says, how many forms or factors of authentication is it to have a user ID and password, a smart card and PIN, and that's the question. And so immediately you say, okay, user ID and password, smart card and PIN, and one of the answers will be 4. One of the answers will be 1. One of the answers will be 2. One of the answers will be 3. So you'll see 4 answers, and you'll say to yourself, okay, user ID is something I know, right? Password is something I know. Okay, so that's 1. Both of those are 1. So I have 1. And then the smart card is something I have. So there's 2. And then the PIN is something I know. So really, there's 3 something I know there, and 1 something I have. So really, that is two-factor authentication, and that is considered strong authentication. So don't get tricked on the exam by that question, because you will see something very similar to that.